Hello, everyone. Professor Raffaelli, don't go away. You are on. All right, our next speaker is Professor Enrico Raffaelli, who has been here at the University of Toronto since 2007. And Professor Raffaelli is speaking on Zoroastrianism and Judaism in dialogue. Professor Raffaelli.
Okay, I'll start. I'm happy to be presenting at this event in honor of Dr. Bagli, whom I've known since, like Professor Tavakoli was saying, since I came to Toronto in 2007, and over the years I've met him several times, and I've taken advantage of his insightfulness, commitment to the community, and generosity on all levels. And I can also testify to the high reputation he enjoys, not only on the local level in Toronto and I would say in North America, but also abroad, because of course I met people who know him in India, but more surprisingly, I met Parsis who knew him and were consulting him on religious stuff in South Africa. Okay, so my presentation now. Zoroastrian apocalyptic texts present similarities in structure and contents with texts of other Near Eastern religious traditions. Such similarities are possibly the result of doctrinal exchanges that happened in antiquity among Zoroastrians and members of other religious communities. The analysis of these affinities can therefore enrich our knowledge of the religious history of the ancient Near East. In the following, I intend to present some considerations of relevance to the study of these affinities by focusing on the history of the Zoroastrian apocalyptic literature and on its relationship to Jewish apocalyptic literature and to Christian apocalyptic literature, two literary corpora with deep connection to each other, Christianity being originally a Jewish sect. Then I will analyze two passages of a Zoroastrian and of a Jewish apocalyptic text that have similar contents. I first need to remember that the distinctive characteristics of the apocalypse genre have been variously defined in the history of scholarship. Among these definitions, the one that I consider the most precise, as it allows to differentiate in the clearest way the apocalypses from the other religious texts, is that according to which an apocalypse is a text focused on a revelation provided, usually through a dialogue, by a supernatural being to a human. The contents of this revelation concern the final salvation of the pious humans and the destruction of the evil ones, and involve the structure of the supernatural world and the activity of the supernatural beings. Texts of this type have been identified among other religious traditions in Judaism, Christianity, and in Zoroastrianism. In Judaism, apocalypses fitting the definition I have mentioned were composed since at least the 2nd century BC. In Christianity, they were produced starting from the 1st century CE, when the religion started, whereas in Zoroastrianism, apocalypses are only documented in the Pahlavi literature of the early Islamic times. The Zoroastrian apocalypses that have come down to us are the Zand Wahman, at least according to the definition I follow, the Zand Wahman, which means explanation of the hymn to Wahman, and the Arda Viraz Namag, the Book of the Righteous Viraz. These texts can be defined as apocalypses because they're focused on revelations given in dialogues by supernatural beings, the supreme god or Mazda in the Zandi Wahman, and the divine beings Zrosh and Dadur in the Arda Viraz Namag, to humans, the prophet Zoroaster in the Zandi Wahman, and the pious Viraz, that's the name, in the Arda Viraz Namag. These revelations are of eschatological topic, as they concern the definitive destruction of the evil and the salvation of the good individuals, and furthermore concern the structure of the otherworldly region and involve the activity of otherworldly entities. References to eschatology, to otherworldly spaces, and to the activity of supernatural beings are present in Zoroastrian literature since the Avesta, the collection of Zoroastrian writings, which date from centuries before the Common Era. dialogues between a human, typically the prophet Zoroaster, and a divine being, typically Ahura Mazda, the Avesta name of Ormazd, are also present in Zoroastrian texts starting from the Avesta. Nevertheless, the fact that the Zand Yasn and the Ardaviraz entirely consist of revelations of eschatological topic provided by the supernatural agent to a human, and at the same time make reference to another worldly dimension, sets these texts apart from all other Zoroastrian texts. The versions that we have received of the Zand Yasn and of the Ardaviraz date to no later than the 9th, 10th centuries of the Common Era, although they are at least in part the re-elaborations of texts of the Sasanian period, meaning 3rd to 7th centuries of the Common Era. The much later date of the two Zoroastrian apocalypses compared to the Jewish and Christian apocalypses makes the hypothesis that the Jewish and subsequently Christian apocalyptic literature have a Zoroastrian background speculative. Considering the chronology of the Zoroastrian apocalypses, one can rather hypothesize that during the Sasanian times, Iranians became familiar with the Jewish and Christian apocalyptic texts. During the Sasanian period, Irano-Jewish contacts were intense and sizable, and culturally influential communities existed in Iran. Apocalypses were well known and popular among the Jewish and Christian communities that lived in the empire. So one can propose that Jewish and Christian apocalyptic texts inspired Zoroastrians to create a new type of works, comprising and combining some elements of their traditional literature, that is, the motif of the dialogues between a human and a supernatural being, and the interest for the eschatological events, for the supernatural world, and for the activity of the supernatural entities. I want to emphasize that only the narrative structure of the Zand Yasn and the Ardaviraz can be supposed to have been influenced by other religious traditions, by other religious literature, but their contents are entirely in line with the tenets and themes of Zoroastrian literature. Also, regardless of how they came to be created, the Zand Yasn and the Ardaviraz are among the most narratively powerful texts of Pahlavi literature. Thanks to the liveliness of their narrations, these texts helped their audience in the early Islamic time to preserve their faith and to endure the hardship they were experiencing by promising them a reward for their piety and the defeat and punishment of their enemies. The Zand Yasn and the Ardaviraz have furthermore helped the members of the Zoroastrian communities for centuries after the composition, as they have been accessible to them through translation from Pahlavi into the languages they spoke, such as New Persian. Further, I want to study a theme that is found both in a Jewish apocalypse, the 2nd century BC book of Daniel, and in the Zoroastrian Zand Yasn, the text that I've already mentioned more than once. The theme of the metals representing historical periods. It will be recalled that the theme of the metals representing historical periods occurs first in classical literature. In the classical myth, the decreasing value of the metals representing historical ages parallels a decrease in the living conditions of the people living during those ages. In the book of Daniel explains the symbolism of a statue that the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar saw in a dream, whose parts are made in metals of decreasing value: gold, silver, bronze, and iron mixed with clay. These metals represent 4 different universal kingdoms, ruling one after another, each of which has a decreasing value compared to the previous one. In the Zand Yasn, in the first chapter, Zoroaster receives from Ormazd a vision of a tree with 4 branches made out of gold, silver, steel, and mixed iron. The first 3 of these metal branches, Ormazd subsequently explains to the prophet, represent the periods of rule of 3 kings who will promote the Zoroastrian faith, starting from King Vishtaspa, the patron of Zoroaster himself. Whereas the branch made of mixed iron corresponds to the future period of rule of the demons, whom Zoroastrians in the early Islamic times would have identified with the foreign rulers of Iran, who were enemies of their religion. In chapter 3, of the Zand Wahman Yasn, another chapter, Zoroaster receives another vision of a tree, which this time has 7 metal branches: gold, silver, copper, brass, lead, steel, and mixed iron. Again, Ormazd identifies the first 6 of these metals with the periods of rule of Vishtasp and of other kings who will support Zoroastrianism, and identifies the last one with the period of rule of the demons. This second vision is the basis for the rest of the text, where Ormazd provides Zoroaster a forecast of the calamities that will fall upon the Zoroastrian community at the end of the 10th millennium of Zoroastrian cosmic history, and of the subsequent salvation of the community, which prefigures the salvation of all humanity at the end of time. The relationship between the theme of the ages represented by metals found in the Book of Daniel and in the Zoroastrian sources has been studied by various scholars in the past. Different interpreters have expressed the opinion that the theme, as found in the Book of Daniel, derives from a Zoroastrian source, or vice versa, that the theme found in Pahlavi literature derives from the Book of Daniel. Recently, the opinion has also been expressed that the theme of the ages represented by metals was elaborated independently in the Book of Daniel and in Zoroastrian Pahlavi literature. I think that while previous interpreters have presented very valuable observations on the relationship between the Book of Daniel and Zoroastrian sources, they have not taken into consideration some aspects relevant to the analysis of this relationship. With respect to this relationship, it is important to observe that both the passage of chapter 1 and that of chapter 3 of the Zand Wahman Yasn that contain the visions of the tree claim to originate from the Pahlavi versions of Avestan texts. It is also important to observe that in addition to the Zand Wahman Yasn, in Pahlavi literature, the theme of the ages symbolized by metals is also found in different passages of the 10th century Pahlavi religious encyclopedia, Denkard, about which you have heard, a text that you've heard about in Ted Good's presentation. None of these passages of the Denkard, though, can be characterized as belonging in the apocalypse genre. In more than one of these passages of the Denkard, the origin of the theme of the metals representing ages is attributed to the sacred canon. The passages of the sacred texts from which the Zand Wahman Yasn and the Denkard claim to originate have not come down to us. Nevertheless, at least one passage of the Denkard which mentions an age symbolized by mixed iron, which is characterized by moral and political havoc, and is presented as deriving from the Zoroastrian sacred corpus, might indeed derive, based on its formulation, from an Avestan passage. I'm saying based on its formulation because the word order seems to reflect the order of Avestan grammar, which is different from that of Pahlavi, or the Pahlavi language. Therefore, the image of a negative age represented by mixed iron could have been elaborated in Zoroastrianism well before the composition of the Book of Daniel, as the period of composition of the Avesta ended approximately 2 centuries before that of the Book of Daniel. Further, in the fullest description of the theme of the ages symbolized by metals found in the Zand Wahman Yasn and in one passage of Book 9 of the Denkard, which ascribes this theme to the sacred corpus, the historical phases that precede the negative period in mixed iron are not presented as declining in value. Rather, they are presented as equally positive periods during which the Zoroastrian religion is strong and the forces of evil are defeated. The lists of historical periods in these passages are therefore consistent with the Zoroastrian view that human history, before and after the introduction of the Zoroastrian faith, is not characterized by a gradual decline, but rather by an alternation between negative moments during which the seed spreads and positive moments during which righteousness prevails. The inconsistency between the value of the metals or other than mixed iron and the ages they correspond to is a major difference between these passages of Pahlavi literature and the Book of Daniel, along with the classical sources where the motif of the metal ages occurs, where, as I mentioned previously, the declining value of the metals does match with that of the periods they correspond to. Therefore, I propose that the presence of the motif of the ages in metal of declining value was originally adopted in Zoroastrian sacred sources by taking inspiration from one of those non-Iranian sources without adopting its original underlying symbolism. I consider the possibility that the theme of the Metal Ages, as described in classical sources, had an impact on Iran as a mere unsupported hypothesis. On the contrary, the Book of Daniel could have been a channel of transmission into Zoroastrianism of such theme. The Book of Daniel has, in fact, been highly popular among both the Jewish and Christian communities throughout history. These communities could have transmitted the theme of a sequence of 4 Metal Ages to Zoroastrianism during the Sasanian era, the first period to which this motif can be ascribed in Zoroastrian literature. Different elements may have facilitated the adoption into the Zoroastrian lore of the motif found in the Book of Daniel of the 4 ages in metal, of which the last one is a mixed metal. One such element is the fact that, as I have pointed out above, in the Avesta mixed metal was possibly associated with a negative historical period. Another such element is the fact that in the context of the Zoroastrian worldview, the theme of mixed iron is connected to different levels of significance. The image of a mixed impure metal is indeed reminiscent of the Zoroastrian view of the material world as characterized by a mixture of good and evil, and also this image aptly reflects the situation of trouble in which the Zoroastrians of Iran lived at different times during the pre-Islamic period as well as after that period. Further, the Zand testified to an expansion after its initial adoption of the motif of the 4 ages in metal by creating a sequence of 7 ages to match a number with sacred nature in Zoroastrianism. I think many Zoroastrians in the room know that 7 is a sacred number in the tradition. And following this notation, I would like to present some considerations on the representation in the Zand Yasn of the ages in metal as branches of trees. This trait has connections with a motif encountered in other Pahlavi texts and also has parallels in apocalypses from Jewish literatures. First of all, in the Zand Yasn, Ormazd reveals to Zoroaster that the trees he has a vision of represent the material world. This identification is in line with a comparison made elsewhere in Pahlavi literature of the Zoroastrian religion, the Den, that's the Pahlavi name, to a tree. In fact, in the Zand Yasn, the branches of the trees that Zoroaster sees correspond to some important periods of the history of the Zoroastrian religion. The use in the text of the tree as a representation of phases of the history of the religion reflects the Zoroastrian view of religion as an entity that underlies the course of the history of the living world, accompanying humanity along the path of righteousness. On another note, trees, being sources of nourishment, can be associated with long life and therefore ultimately immortality, as well as with knowledge, a property that is also a source of figurative nourishment. Also, the tree grows gradually in the same way as knowledge increases, or is supposed to increase, over the course of time. Immortality and knowledge are indeed central aspects of the Zand Yasn, a text in which Zoroaster receives from Ormazd the revelation on the eschatological fate of the Iranians and more in general of apocalyptic literature, which is focused on revelations of eschatological type. The association of the tree with immortality and knowledge can therefore be seen as yet another reason for the use of the tree as a conveyor of Ormazd's revelation in the Zand Yasn. On a broader level, this association explains the presence of images of trees in other apocalyptic texts. As an example, I will mention the occurrence of images of trees in one of the earliest apocalypses recorded, the Jewish Book of the Watchers, 3rd century or 2nd century BC. This text mentions in particular 2 trees, mentions many trees actually, but in particularly 2 that are directly associated to long life and knowledge, the tree of life and the tree of knowledge of good and evil that are known from the book of Genesis. I consider the recurrence of images of trees in apocalyptic texts of different traditions as a reflection of how different religions independently assign to the same theme the same symbolism, reflecting the eschatological revelatory nature of the apocalypse genre. To summarize, following the considerations I have proposed, the literary genre apocalypse, consisting of a revelation provided by a deity to a human focused on eschatology and involving a supernatural dimension, might have developed in Zoroastrianism in the Sasanian times, when the Zoroastrian apocalypses we have received have their roots in part under inspiration of Jewish and Christian apocalypses. The theme of the ages in metal possibly emerged in Zoroastrianism in the Sasanian times under the influence of the book of Daniel by developing a notion stemming from the Avesta, that is, the association of mixed iron with a negative period. The development of the theme of the ages in metal in the Pahlavi text is in line with different traits of Zoroastrian theology, such as the representation of the religion as a tree, as well as with a trait common to apocalyptic texts from different religious traditions, that is, the association of the tree with immortality and knowledge. To conclude, I want to point out that while my notations have mostly focused on possible influences of Jewish and Christian apocalypses on Zoroastrian apocalypses, Zoroastrianism was also the likely source of some eschatological doctrines, several indeed, found in the apocalypses of other religions, including Judaism and Christianity. The topic of the possible influences of Zoroastrianism on Jewish and Christian apocalypses has been analyzed multiple times in previous research, but like the themes I have studied today, it still deserves investigation, as I hope to have an opportunity to show in future presentations. Thanks. I'm done.
Thank you, Professor.
Thanks. Thanks.
We have a few minutes for questions, please.
Enrico, just one quick question. The list you gave, you did not include the Ayadgari Zamak the Jamasnam. I was curious why.
Yes.
Because
yes.
Particularly in terms of this audience, yes, the Jamasname would be one I think most people would identify. Yeah. I was curious why you didn't include that one.
Okay, yeah, absolutely. Now, so I've been following a little bit strictly, maybe too strictly, the definition of apocalypse that has been provided a few decades ago by a team of scholars that work together to provide what characterizes an apocalypse in Judaism, Christianity, Zoroastrianism, classical literature, Gnosticism. And so, according to this definition, apocalypse is a text that consists of a revelation provided by a divine being to a human regarding eschatological events. In the Ayadgari Jamaspig, it's actually a human to a human. Now, of course, this is just a formal difference. Nevertheless, from the point of view of the classification, it is important. Of course, I have to say that when we define apocalypses and when we follow the definition I followed, we have to keep into account that Zoroastrianism might not really completely, in Zoroastrian literature, the definition of apocalypses could be a little bit broadened to include at least that text. But here I wanted to be a little bit stricter.
Chapters 15 and 16 there in particular.
Absolutely.
But in a similar way, just in passing, you mentioned the classical heritage, and you seem to dismiss it. So Hesiod to Ovid, ages from 4 to 5 ages of the world, and then even extending Augustine with 6 to 7 ages of the world. And I was just curious.
No. But, yes, the idea is just that I think I find it harder to hypothesize that classical, based on the chronology. So we have Sasanian times. In Sasanian times, I find it easier to think that Jewish or Christian communities really transmitted to Zoroastrians the idea of ages rather than classical texts that might have been known to Zoroastrians in the Sasanian times, but it's less easily than the book of Daniel. Nevertheless, of course, maybe I've dismissed it a little bit too.
I'm curious only because, for example, you can see, I've talked about the fact that even
being translations of classical texts on the Iranian plateau. So I'm just passing those out.
No, just because we're talking of classical literature in Sasanian Iran, I'm a bit cautious in thinking about that. But of course, I mean, if I had to publish this, I would really talk more extensively of that possibility. Yeah. No, it's not working. There's one question. Okay.
Just a simple question.
Yeah.
Which religion would you say came first? Judaism or Zoroastrianism? And if you can describe some time frame to each one of them. Thank you.
So, I mean, I'll focus only on the topic of eschatology, of the views about the end, so final events, all that relates to apocalypse, because we're talking about the final events. I would say that in Zoroastrianism, the views about the final events are earlier than in Judaism. So that's why I say that Jewish apocalyptic literature can definitely have themes of Zoroastrian origin, such as the resurrection of the bodies, or the view of a punishment after death or reward after death. In that respect, Zoroastrianism comes first. So in the earliest Jewish apocalypse, such as the Book of the Watchers that I mentioned, we do find notions such as, again, the punishment of the souls of the sinners, and also final judgment by God that might have been familiar. I mean, the Jewish populations might have gotten familiar with these ideas through an Iranian channel. So we're talking of ideas that in Zoroastrianism are documented in, say, 10th century BC, or at the latest 5th century BC. In Jewish sources, it's hard to really recognize them firmly before the 3rd century. So we're talking of at least a couple of centuries of difference. Okay, so yeah, thanks.
One question.
Okay.
The argument that you're making
Yeah.
is the reverse of an argument that a colleague of ours,
Yeah.
Sariana Metso, who's the
Yes.
Hebrew Bible scholar, was making several years ago, and arguing that Jewish and Christian apocalyptic thought was informed by.
Yes. So here, what I think we should make a distinction between is themes. So we find Iranian Zoroastrian themes in Jewish apocalypses. But then when we talk of a literary genre that we define as a text that is revealed by divinity, so a literary genre that is defined as a revelation of eschatological topic provided by a divine being to a human, in that case, I would think that Jewish apocalypse is from, again, a formal structural, narrative structure level. Jewish apocalypses come first, and that's why.
If you take a historical approach and think of the apocalyptic thinking changing over time, then focusing on a formalistic structural definition may not.
Okay, but well, that would require a further explanation of how the narrative narrative frameworks of apocalypses does have some implications. But anyway, for sure, the ideas that we find in Jewish apocalypses, some of them might have a Zoroastrian background, not the genre itself, anyway. Okay. 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 Thanks.
Thanks a lot. All right. Our next speaker is Dr. Pegah Shahbaz, who's a research fellow at the Center for South Asian Studies at the University of Toronto, and she will be speaking on the Persian prophet and American philosopher. Please.
Could you please show me how I can change the slides? Okay, in bracket. Thank you very much. I would like to thank Professor Tawakkoli Targhi for inviting me to the symposium. I would also like to express my gratitude to Professors Enrico Raffaelli and Miguel Andre Toledo for their collegiality and kind support of my research. What I'm presenting today is a section taken from my past research on Waldo Emerson and the impact that Persian literature and culture had on him. Our audience today must have heard the name of the most prominent American poet, philosopher of the 19th century, Ralph Waldo Emerson, who, along with his contemporaries such as Henry David Thoreau, Margaret Fuller, William Wordsworth, and others, launched the intellectual movement of Transcendentalism in Great Britain and America in the 19th century. Emerson was born and brought up in Boston, studied at Harvard Divinity School, and later at law school, traveled to Europe and England, and actively took part in the foundation of the intellectual exchanges of his time. During his life, Emerson wrote manifold pages of journals, now published in 10 volumes, and he expressed his thoughts on diverse subjects related to human beings' individual and social concerns in several essays, the most important of which are Nature, Self-Reliance, Poet, Society and Solitude, and Character. Emerson was also a poet, and along with composing poems, he translated poetry from Asian languages via the intermediary of European languages. He was a fan of Persian poetry and read translations from German of poems by Sa'di, Hafiz, Anbari, Khaju, etc. The translations were mostly done by Joseph von Hammer-Purgstall. He was inspired by that poetry in his own verses as well. Emerson lived at the time of the Orientalists, who played an active role in the introduction and translation of Asian literatures to the West. The approaches towards this literature were not only philological and literary, but also broadened the scope of sociocultural debates and religious studies as reflected within texts. Scholars recruited in colonial institutions such as the Royal Asiatic Society in India, East India Company in Persia, in India, and also in China, collaborated with native scholars of Oriental languages for collecting, decoding, reading, and rendering the major canonical texts of each nation. Many of the translations were produced in free style and included erroneous attributions and interpretations. Emerson lived in this historical period called by the French scholar Edgar Quinet, Renaissance Orientale. Influenced by the current intellectual fashions of his time, he was attracted to the wisdom of the East, which he described as joyful wisdom. He showed interest in acquiring knowledge about old languages and found access to French, German, and English renderings from ancient languages such as Middle Persian and Sanskrit. He began reading them in his early 20s and continued his education about ancient scriptures all through his life. He clearly mentioned in his journals the books that he borrowed from the library in his college days about the Pahlavi language and the Zoroastrian texts. His journals include manifold references to the sacred texts, which he believed were timeless. In his own words, he says, "See how nations and races flit by on the sea of time and leave no ripple to tell where they floated or sunk. And one good soul shall make the name of Moses or of Zoroaster reverend forever." For years, he kept a separate journal called The Orientalist, where he entered all quotations and ideas relating to the Orient, including his notes on Zoroastrianism and what he had found in books written by Parsis. With Henry David Thoreau, they published ethical scriptures in the Dial periodical of the Transcendentalists between 1842 and 1843, where they published selections from different sacred Oriental books. Emerson's knowledge about Zoroastrianism came from the books that were available to him in European languages. The books that he had at his disposal were a mix of first-hand and second-hand books, either translations of texts such as Vendidad, the Satir, or Zend Avesta, or the analytical treatises that provided a general view about Zoroaster as a prophet and the writings that were attributed to him. Some of them are as follows. The Zend Avesta, translated by Anquetil Duperron and published in, I think it's, no, he passed away in 1805. I think it was in 1770s, 76, that he published his translation in France. L'histoire de l'Académie des inscriptions et belles-lettres, the Dasatir, translated by Mullah Firuz ibn Kawus, the Dabastan and Mazaheb, and also some secondary sources such as Great Religions of the World, the Sacred Books of the East, and the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. Some of these books attributed texts to Zoroasters and Zoroastrian Magians in Greek and Roman sources. They included translations from Pahlavi. These sources also included Zoroastrian communities in Iran and observations of Zoroastrian communities in Iran and in India by Western travelers and scholars such as Chagrin and Tavernier. Some amongst them provided info about the life of Zoroaster. Some others were descriptions of his religion, and some others provided mythological studies of the religious content. Along with Mahabharata, Vishnu Purana, and other Hindu scriptures, Emerson started reading Zend Avesta. In 1832, he mentioned Zoroaster in one of his journals. In his journal, dated April 17th, 1832, he left a 2-page long note under the title of Persian Scriptures, where he discussed what he had thought about Zoroastrianism according to the sources he had consulted, such as l'Histoire de l'Académie des Inscriptions. He says, a strange poem is Zoroastrianism. It is a system as separate and harmonious, as sublime as Swedenborgianism. It's a system of philosophical and religious doctrine that Emanuel Swedenborg put forward. And it focuses on the spiritual structure of the universe. One would be glad to behold the truth which they all shadow forth, for it cannot but be truth, but they typify and symbolize, as the play of every faculty reveals a use, a cause, and a law to the intelligent. One sees in this and in them all the element of poetry according to Jeffrey's true theory, the effect produced by making everything outward only a sign of something inward. Plato's forms and ideas seem almost tantamount to the pharaohs of Zoroaster. Of all the pharaohs of beings that should exist in the world, the most precious in the eyes of Ormazd were that of law, that of Iran, and that of Zoroaster. But what I would have quoted just now to illustrate the poetry theory is this: Fire, the son of Ormazd, was also created. He represented, though imperfectly, the original fire which animates all beings, forms the relations which exist between them, and which in the beginning was a principle of union between Ormazd and time sans borne. By the way, I cannot help putting in here an exquisite specimen of vraisemblance in fiction. Among the evil persons and things produced by Ahriman, it is said, Ahriman produisit même une espèce de feu ténébreux, dont vient celui de la fièvre. Here is one of the sentences. Gaucheron, the name of a deity, rejoicing before Ormazd at the prospect of the creation of Zoroaster, says, I said to the heaven in the beginning, when there was no night, that there must be purity of thought, of word, and of action. In his article Character, Emerson narrated a parable about a Greek man visiting Zoroaster, which he had taken from the Desatir. He says, when the Yunani sage arrived at Balkh, the Persians tell us, Goshtasp appointed a day on which the Mobeds of every country should assemble, and a golden chair was placed for the Yunani sage. Then the beloved of Yazdan, the prophet Zertosht, advanced into the midst of the assembly. The Yunani sage, on seeing that chief, said, this form in this gate cannot lie, and nothing but truth can proceed from them. Emerson's outlook towards Zoroaster and his doctrine was approving and positive. He mentioned him several times along with the names of other prophets and thinkers of Asian cultures. In his essay, History, he states how easily these old worships of Moses, of Zoroaster, of Menu, of Socrates domesticate themselves in the mind. I cannot find any antiquity in them. They are mine as much as theirs. In his famous essay, Self-Reliance, he elaborates on the idea of self-helping man, representative of the ideal, responsible human being, saying, for him, all doors are flung wide. Him, all tongues greet. All honors crown. All eyes follow with desire. The gods love him because men hated him. As Zoroaster said, to the preserving mortal, the blessed immortals are swift. Now, there were polemics and controversial ideas regarding the authenticity of the Zoroastrian sources that Emerson consulted in translation. Let's take Zand Avesta, for example. Zand Avesta is the Pahlavi interpretation of Avesta produced in the Sasanian period. And it was translated into French the first time by Anquetil du Perron in the year 1771. Zend was the sacred book of the Parsis in India, and during his trip to India, du Perron discovered this book and brought it back with him to Europe, and later on translated it into French. Sir William Jones immediately disputed the authenticity of the text and claimed that Anquetil du Perron had been duped by the Parsis with modern forgeries. And this claim by Jones impacted the study of this text for many years. He raised questions about the antiquity of the language and argued that such tales, absurd laws, and descriptions of gods and demons could not be the work of a wise prophet like Zoroaster. His arguments were accepted by certain scholars in England and Germany, and it was refused by some others. Johann Friedrich Klocker, supporter of du Perron, published a German translation of the book immediately afterwards based on Duperron's rendering in the year 1789. Emerson referred to Zand Avesta as the Zoroastrian Bible in his article Books. His response to the supposed translations of Zoroaster's words being forgeries was revealing of his lack of concern regarding the authenticity of the text, and his semantic consideration of the text and its message was more important to him. The questions about the authenticity of the text did not stop him from accrediting them for the philosophy integrated within them. He seemed to care little about the question whether the Zand Avesta or the De Saussure are genuine antiques or modern counterfeits. He wrote, "As I am only concerned with the good sentences, and it is indifferent how old the truth is, whether an hour or 5 centuries." In his essay, History, he says how easily these old worships of Moses, of Zoroaster, of Manu, of Menu, and of Socrates domesticate themselves in the mind. He also wrote about the Oriental book collection that he had in his library, which he found were indispensable for him. He says, despite the fact that he doesn't have any room, yet still he would like to keep the De Saussure of Persians and the Zoroastrian oracles. That one I read already. So he says, these are scriptures which the missionary might well carry over prairies, desert, and ocean, to Siberia, to Japan, to Timbuktu. Yet he will find that the spirit which is in them journeys faster than he and greets him on his arrival. Although Emerson was a Christian priest, through his philosophy of transcendentalism, he promoted a universal outlook towards the religions of the world. He saw Christianity not as an exclusive religion, but as one amongst many others, and believed that religions transmitted one message of unity through their texts. He sought wisdom in the treasures of Brahman, just as he did in the volumes attributed to Zoroaster. In his essay, Experience, he says, I'm just trying to make it short. Fortune, Minerva, Muse, Holy Ghost, these are quaint names, too narrow to cover the unbounded substance. The baffled intellect must still kneel before this cause, which refuses to be named. Ineffable cause, which every fine genius has essayed to represent by some symbol, as Thales with water, Anaximenes by air, Anaxagoras, Greek philosopher, by thought, Zoroaster by fire, Jesus and the moderns by love. As a cosmopolitan thinker, the philosophy of transcendentalism that Emerson introduced and put forward reflected connections between Neoplatonism, Persian Zoroastrianism, and Oriental mysticism. Neoplatonism is a thought form rooted in the philosophy of Plato by extending beyond or transforming it in many respects. Neoplatonism developed as a school of thought in the Roman Empire. And what is very interesting about it is that it focused on the idea of duality between the finite world and the infinite world, which was the ideal form of being. Such ideas could also be traced in Oriental schools of thought, such as Ibn al-Arabi's unity of being philosophy, or Sahrawardi's illumination cult, which had roots in pre-Islamic creeds of Iran, and of course also in Zoroastrianism. Emerson's essay Plato contains the kernel of Emerson's Orientalism and reflects the similarities that he noticed in the dualism that existed in Neoplatonic system of thought and in Zoroastrianism. Amongst the most important common features that he discusses is the duality that exists between good and evil, illustrated as in Ahura Mazda and in Angra Mainyu, which he refers to in his articles. He also refers to the application of light and darkness as the best symbolic representations for good and evil. He considered fire also as the perfect symbol for representing the divine. Despite all the borrowings and inspirations that he received from Asian spirituality, philosophy, and religion, he remained selective towards the knowledge that he borrowed and incorporated into his writings. He reinterpreted them in the service of his own ideas about religion and philosophy. As he wrote himself in 1857 in his journals, "We read the Orientals, but remain Occidental." The impact that he left on the next generation of Western philosophers continues to be seen in Friedrich Nietzsche's work, Thus Spake Zarathustra, which I hope to discuss later in another conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Shahbaz. We are running short, but entertaining one or two brief questions. Yes, sir.
Thanks for your presentation very much. I wonder, I particularly agree with you in the last paragraph you mentioned that this is really an Occidental reinterpretation, refashioning of Eastern ideas mixed with other ideas. In many respects, Zarathustra is an instrumentality of the philosophy of Transcendentalism that Emerson and others are putting forward, aren't they? I mean, he could have chosen some other Eastern philosopher, or he could have spoken of other things too. In a sense, I think I would place your argument more in a larger context of what is going on at the time in the West and how the West are borrowing Eastern ideas, but really also in opposition to the rise of science and what science is doing, and that these are creative new concepts that intellectuals are coming up with in the West to sort of counter scientific ideas as much as anything else. Just a thought.
Yes, thank you very much for your note. I actually agree with you because the way he approaches Zoroaster could be compared to the way he approaches Buddhist texts, Hindu texts, and also Islamic mysticism. And as I said, he has been selective. He selected what served him best in promoting his idea of transcendentalism. At the same time, we should also bear in mind that in the colonial period, countries, lands such as India or Persia were being discovered in all forms and from different aspects at various levels. For different purposes as well. If in 1832, Emerson publishes writes 2 pages about Zoroastrianism in his journal, it's not a coincidence that in the same year we have Parsis in India going on a riot for massacring of the wandering dogs in the street. So there was an idea of dominance and rulership behind all these studies as well. I'd take this into account. And in order to figure out how to rule over the communities in those lands, they would invest in studying and reading about their culture, their laws, their communities, structures, and that also formed and shaped their own knowledge. And I have to say, unfortunately, that has continued up to the present time. If we go to departments of Oriental studies in Europe, we still see the shadow of such interpretations being very much present.
And a Waldo, Emerson, or a Thoreau, who are not scholars.
In what sense? Of course, they are different. Of course, William Jones' education approach towards...
He translated things and he discovered the links between Sanskrit and European languages. Other people, Henry Wilson, many others, these are British Oriental true scholars who studied it. Waldo Emerson is somebody who's reading the works of others and fantasizing some new philosophy.
He was walking under the shadow of Orientalists such as William Jones, the Persian Jones, let's say. Jones was a polyglot. He knew several languages. He traveled to India. He stayed there. He created glossaries, the earliest glossaries that we have, you know, for these languages such as Sanskrit. Of course, his approach was different, and he also lived about a century before Emerson, or at least 5 generations before Emerson started his work. So Emerson did not know Oriental languages. He did not study Persian, so he was dependent on the works of scholars that were available to him. Of course, I do not see him as an Orientalist, but he lived under the shadow of the Orientalists, and he consulted their works.
Thank you, Dr. Shahbaz. Excellent.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Our next speaker is Miguel Angel Andres Toledo, the Faizana Professor of Zoroastrian Languages and Literature, and he will be speaking on the Avestan footnotes of Anquetil de Prom, right?
No.
No?
Quite different, as we will see.
It doesn't.
But still. Well, first of all, let me thank Ervad Dr. Jehan Bagli, first for his extreme kindness and generosity. He has been so kind to me always since I met him. It's been always a pleasure to meet him, to talk to him, to learn very much about many topics talking to him. Also, thank you to Professor Mohammad Tabakoli for organizing this event in his honor. And of course, thank you to all the present and online audience, in some cases abroad in distant places and in sometimes remote hours. So thanks to all of them. I will speak about Avestan footnotes, and first of all, why I chose this title. What do I mean with Avestan footnotes? We are used to footnotes in our standard books, which is basically something written on the last part of the page or whatever. But the question is it possible that Avestan speakers had something similar that we are missing, that we can't see easily? That's the topic, basically, of the presentation. And before that, we have to put this in a context. We know that in India, in the first millennium, there were several very famous, very important commentaries, like the famous Brahmana, like Yaska's Nirukta, and also during those centuries, during this millennia, and later on, many other important commentaries. But the question is, do we have something similar in Avestan? And if so, how can we reach that knowledge? My point would be through linguistic criteria. The main problem is Avestan glosses and commentaries were incorporated into and eventually diluted with the ritual recitation of the text they commented upon, thus conforming a continuous text in which commentarial activity is hardly visible. So imagine a very beautiful landscape totally covered with snow. That would be the ritual. But the point is there something beneath that ice, beneath that snow? That's the main problem in the presentation. But there are also other related problems. Like, for instance, what happens if adding to this snow, we have some fog, which is basically the way the texts were transmitted. In this concrete case, in the manuscripts, the lack of punctuation marks. The scribes of Avesta manuscripts, as you can see, did not add specific punctuation marks, which may help us delimit the beginning or end of a commentary. Also, the authors of those commentaries are sometimes, or almost always, basically invisible. So the point is, the texts neither mention explicitly the names of the authors of Avestan glosses and commentaries, nor their schools, unlike Indian tradition, in which we have a lot of names and a lot of very clear identifiable authors. But there is also the problem of their invisible activity. Even if they are talking to us, it's not so easy to know when they are talking to us. So basically, they don't include any implicit hint of their activity, like, for instance, verbs of noun or thinking, verbs or nouns of thinking or saying, and change or grammatical person or number. So it's not easy to know when they are speaking. And in the end, we have such an amazing ritual landscape, such an impressive thing to study, that in the end, even if they are talking, sometimes we don't listen to them. There is a lack of interest in the research. And we don't know the techniques, the words, or the syntax employed by the Avestan commentators, which of course remain unknown to us. So, are we totally blind in this landscape? No, we are not. There are few things we can know at least. In the field, in our Iranian studies and in Zoroastrian studies, there is a kind of consensus according to which at least 3 books of the Yasna, which are the books 19, 20, and 21, include commentaries. This is the section so-called Bagan Yasn, and it includes very clearly identifiable commentaries. Commentaries on the 3 important sacred prayers, the Hashem Bohu, the Yathahu Vairio, and the Yenhe Hatam. In fact, they are interpreted as young Avestan commentaries on those prayers transmitted in the Yasna. Previous research on the linguistic side of this has already been done, but in very few things, as we will see right now. The first is by Karl Friedrich Keltner, who basically was the first at identifying some lexical peculiarities of the technical language of the young Avestan commentators of these 3 passages of the Yasna. Indeed, as he discovered, the enclitics, an enclitic word is a word placed after another. The enclitic forms Avestan, Ida, and Itha were used in a similar way to Sanskrit iti, which means literally thus, and is used by commentators to mark commentaries. He also discovered that the Avestan suffix tad, which is an abstract suffix for nouns, was used in a similar way as the Vedic commentators, like for instance the composers of the Brahmana, did with the suffix tva, which means literally ness, translated into English. Developing this and building on that, Jean Kellens also discovered that this Ida, at least in Yasna 19, is usually but not systematically placed in enclitic position also after 2 or more words, and it marks the single term or initial term of the analyzed passage commented on. He also said that in Yasna 20, the terms or full verses are quoted without such Avestan adverb. This is what has been done on the topic, but what is needed now? We need to search for the linguistic patterns that characterize the jargon of the Avestan commentators
to try to isolate Avestan textual from metatextual evidence. And we should actually, from those texts that can be clearly identified as Avestan commentaries, which are Yasn 19 to 21. And then, using this information, broaden our scope to other Avestan texts and see if we discover something similar. Basically, we need to find fantastic glosses and the way to find them. Let's start with Ida. Ida in Yasn 19 and 21 is used in enclitic position after 1, 2, and even 3 words. It introduces quotations of 1 or 2 words, also glosses, but never references to other texts. We will see that with a very concrete example, which is this one. This is part of Yasn 19, actually the chapter 13, and it's a commentary on the prayer Yatha Ahu Vaidio. And the Avestan commentator is quoting certain words and commenting their meaning or their theological interpretation. And here we can see the linguistic devices he used in order to do that. One of them is Ida. We can see here Vanheus, which is the word quoted from the Yathahu Vaidio prayer, immediately followed by Ida, which is that adverb. So it's a marker, a linguistic marker, to say, I'm quoting this, and then I will explain the meaning. So first he said, Vanheus Ida. So the word Vanheus expresses the third teaching. The words Das da mananho, again, quoted with Ida in enclitic position, means after those words, but in this case, several positions after it. The words Das da mananho teach that Mazda or Dasda, that's a double possibility here, is before him. Bohu, Mana, or Manange. He's playing also with the double possibility. Like the word Fradachsteren is before the word Manange in a cross reference in Yasn 31. And he continues, the word Mananjo, again, in this case, we have the word Mananjo, but not with Ida, so not always is used Ida. The word Mananjo refers as much to him, and with him he means Mazda or Dasda, as the word Xiaothunanam refers to the word Ahum, and again, Xiaothunanam is followed by Ida, so as a marker of that quotation. So this is how an Avestan commentary looks like. And as you can see, there are certain linguistic devices that help us identifying things. But the point is, does the use of Ida apply in a similar way in other Avestan texts that have not been identified so far as commentaries? I think so. This is one possible example. Here, an example of the Videvdat 342, in which we see a long text in Avestan, which is actually finished by what I would consider a gloss commenting the previous passage. And that gloss is introduced by Ida. So it's similar, a similar use that we have seen in the commentary of Yasn 19, but in this case, in another context. The context is an explanation at the end of a fragar, which is a chapter, a division of the Videvdat, on atonement. And as we will see, is not an isolated example. We have some other examples of the same use of Ida at the end of a fragar with a gloss at the very end. In this concrete case, we can translate, it wipes away every deed whatsoever that one does. I marked in black the words that will be commented later on. The words that are more important in this concrete case. And it continues, like this, Spitama Zarathustra, the Mazdian religion sweeps away every evil thought, evil word, and evil deed of the righteous man, like the wind strongly blowing from the west, while sweeps away the atmosphere all around. And here we find the gloss. That is Ida. So it's introducing the gloss. Good, Bohu, Zarathustra, means a good deed done. It's basically explaining the previous passage. The good Mazdian religion, in its full forgiveness, prescribes the atonement, and then a final Hashem Bohu that is always found at the end of each fragard to close and finish the fragard. Actually, that's very interesting because Gellner, without mentioning the use of Ida, already thought that this part, the part I mark with the square brackets, could have been a gloss or a commentary. And actually in his critical edition, he marked it in brackets. He did it without mentioning anything about the use of Ida, but in this concrete case, it matches perfectly with what we have seen in Yasna 19. Is there another example of that? There is, and also at the end of a fragard, so at the end of a chapter of the Videvdat, with the use of Ida too. And we see here, this is the atonement for him, this is the expiation for him, so a similar context, the atonement, and the gloss introduced by Ida. In enclitic position, again, in the previous passage we had Vohu Ida, and here we have Aipi Paramnai Ida. So Ida is again introducing this gloss, and it says literally, that is for the righteous one who is repentant, not for him who is not repentant. And then the commentator, the one who glosses the text, adds a quotation from the old Avestan corpus. In this case, in the house of the lie, they will be truly mates. A quotation of Yasna 49. This is regarding the use of Ida, but do we have any other ways of introducing glosses? We do, with Itha. Itha, which means literally thus or in that way, or in this way, sorry, is used in Yasna 19. It's also enclitic after one word introducing a quotation. Also non-enclitic introducing a gloss, and never used for references to other texts. This is an example of the same commentary on the Yathahu Baidio in Yasna 19, but in this case in the following passage in 14, in which we see the use of Itha quoting Mazda, which is of course taken from the final Mazdai in the second verse of the Yathahu Baidio prayer. And the text literally says, that is, it teaches that the word ahum is for the creatures. The word Mazda, Itha, following this word ahum, means that he has the creatures. The words Shatram Ahurai, which are basically quoting Shatram Cha Ahurai, teach the same as the words Tat Mazda Tawa Kshatrem, which is a quotation of Yasna 53. And it continues, the words Drigubyo Vastarem teach the same as the words Urwathem Spitamai, which is again a quotation of Yasna 51. So you see the way commentators operate. They introduce cross-references to the Old Avestan corpus in order to explain theologically what they want to explain in this sacred prayer. And then all the words of this text contain 5 teachings. The proclamation in its entirety is the words of Ahura Mazda. This is a theological commentary. So this is just the use of Itha. But do we have something similar in other parts of the Avestan corpus? Yes, we do. At least this is what I think. We have the example of Yatha. Sorry, Yatha no, because it's Ida, but we have Itha, in this case, introducing a gloss, not a quotation, like in the previous passage. It says literally, Itha, that is, it teaches that he, Ahura Mazda, is prior to the creatures of which Wahman is the first. The word Yatha teaches that he is Vispanan Mazishtem, which is again a reference to another Old Avestan text. And the word Atha, which is of course reproducing Atha, part of the Yatha Ahu Baidio prayer. The word Atha teaches that he has the creatures like Mazda Hoji Tish, again quoting another Old Avestan text. It's a play with cross-references in order to explain theologically what's behind that. But it again is using certain linguistic devices in order to do that. Do we have something similar with Itha? We do, apart from this commentary on Yasn 19. We have it here. Itha introduces a gloss in the passage of the Bidebdat 4:48, which literally says, and this is of these two men, the one who reaches Bohumana more, the one who fills his belly with beef more than the one who does not. And a short gloss is explaining something that is not so easy in Avestan, which is yo noit. Yo noit literally is which not. But because there is no verb, there might be a semantic difficulty. So someone, an Avestan speaker, thought that introducing a gloss in order to explain who is this yo noit could be necessary. And he did it by means of Itha at the very beginning. So exactly the same as he did in the commentary of Yasn 19 we have seen. And basically, it explains the one who does not is dead, in the sense, if he is not eating, he basically would be dead, is what he's saying. And then the rest means, and the former is big as a hikot, as a sheep, and so on and so on. Finally, let's take a look to the use of atha, which is thus or in that way, also marking glosses, never references, also used in an enclitic position, introducing a quotation, and in this concrete case, found in Yasn 20. So in this commentary that is already identified as such. We see it in the passage of Yasn 21, which is a commentary of the Hashem Bohu prayer. And we see at the end, Bohu Bahishte Masti Atha. Atha is marking the quotation. So it's saying this is like basically a way of saying Hashem Bohu Basti, but they don't have the signs we could use in our standard printed books, so they use the word atha, because we have to take into account that these commentaries were oral commentaries that were many, many centuries later put down into writing. So they have linguistic devices that are oral in order to mark those commentaries. And this is the third one, atha. And we see literally, Ahura Mazda said, Hashem Bohu Bahishte Masti. And we have the explanation, the commentary. The syntagm Bohu Bahishtem before the word Ahmai teaches that Bohu, good, is related to Vahishtem, like Huaetawe, to the relative, is related to Huaetatem. Again, a cross-reference in order to explain concrete words of this prayer, cross-references to other Old Avestan texts. And finally, Bohu Bahishte Masti contain that teaching. Interestingly enough, these commentaries are only identified in the scholarly literature as theological commentaries, and that's of course true. But the point is, depending on our understanding of certain words, they might be also grammatical commentaries, because they are playing with the word Bohu Bahishtem, which are related, they are playing with Huaetawe, Huaetatem, that are also related, so we are not totally sure that apart from a theological commentary, we are not dealing with a linguistic reflection on the text, which would be even more interesting. And finally, is this use of atha found in other Avestan texts, in other possible commentaries? In my opinion, it is found. And concretely in this text, which is part of Yasn 10:18. Here we have, these are Hauma, your chants. These are the ones for praising you. These are the ones to be taught. These are the words rightly said. This is the literal way it is transmitted in our manuscripts. That is, the man who praises him during the ceremony, victorious, avoiding hostility, healing. So it might sound a little bit strange what that is the man who praises him is commenting on. The way it is transmitted is not that clear, but what happens if we rearrange that gloss? That's the result, and it's much clearer. Actually, John Collins observed that this is a misplaced gloss, and following his advice in this concrete case, the passage makes total sense. Atha is introducing a gloss that is basically explaining a difficult word that is not found, at least in our standard Avestan corpus, is not found elsewhere, which is the word staumayo. Staumayo, which is literally the ones for praising you, required, according to the Avestan speaker who composed this very short gloss, required an explanation. He introduced that explanation with atha and explained with a verbal syntagm the meaning of the word staumayo. And how did he that? With na, the man, yo, who or which, dim, that or it, stauiti, praises. So basically it's a reformulation with a verbal syntagm of the word staumayo, and this is introduced with atha. So again, the use of atha for adding a gloss. In conclusion, the linguistic patterns that characterize the jargon of the Avestan commentators include the use of Avestan ida, itha, and atha to introduce quotations and glosses in Yasna 19 to 21, but also in other Avestan texts. By knowing more about those markers for Avestan footnotes, that's why I call that Avestan footnotes, we will be able to better understand the Avestan texts beneath their magnificent ritual landscape. Thank you very much.
Some time for questions?
Yeah, so thanks a lot for this really great presentation. I'm curious to know, so you've presented glosses of different types, right? Footnotes, if you prefer. Mm-hmm. And of course, the Yasna 19 to 21 has been studied in depth, and also its function in the ritual has been studied in depth. Mm-hmm. I'm still curious to know what's your opinion on why an entire section of the Yasna is dedicated to a commentary from the ritual point of view, and also what is the ritual function? We know that the texts you've talked about, in addition to the Yasna 1921, so Yasna 10 and Videvdad, they're ritual texts. So what is the function, in your opinion, of including footnotes or glosses in a text that is ritual, especially glosses such as the last one you've presented that explains a rare word, right? So from a ritual point of view, just curious to know your view.
Yeah, of course, that's a very important question. That's a key point. Why they included commentaries in something that is to be recited in a ritual. That's not isolated in other traditions. We know it, for instance, in the Indian tradition, the Vedic schools, when the teachers who were priests were performing the rituals and they were explaining them to their students, they were explaining the rituals to the students in the same way, in another form, and in the middle of the ritual. So they were performing the ritual and adding these glosses that later on were transmitted in our standard text as a joint thing belonging to a ritual. So they became, let's say, a common ritual, but in the end, it was a mix between ritual and teaching part, which in the end was incorporated because it was in the same language. It also happened in the Vedic canon. So it could have been something very similar, actually.
Let me just jump in there. Having watched, and I'm not of a priestly background, but having watched many of the training at the madrasas in India, of this, it's exactly as you describe it. They'll be doing it, and the student will say, "But this, what does it mean?" And they'll stop and they'll explain it. And I could, as you were saying, I could almost sort of picture myself, back in time, and then this getting written down by yet another student who's seated nearby, adding this gloss in. So that last example you left at, what does it mean? First, you're the one praising, so it's he who's doing the praise. I think you can sort of see that working. I've seen it both with the priests performing the rituals and also as they're training the younger generations of priests.
So thank you very much. Yeah. Thank you. Very kind. Thank you.
Hi. Yeah, that was good. I've got two questions, or one is kind of maybe an observation. You referenced the Brahmanas, and just the fact that like the glosses are inside of the text, it made me think of a distinction in the Brahmanas. Like, so in the Yajurveda, there's the black Yajurveda and the white Yajurveda. And so in the white Yajurveda, there's the Samhita, the verse, and it's separate from the Brahmana. But in the black Yajurveda, they're the same text. And so that seems very similar. I don't know if there's more parallels. I don't know it very well.
The Maitrayani Samhita and many other Vedic texts are exactly the same. They combine it. Yeah.
So I guess this is how it was done in the Avesta, rather than separating. And the second thing is just, this might be outside, but in Denkard 9, did they know about this? Did they comment on the distinction between the glosses and the base text?
Well, I think it's quite unlikely that in the Pahlavi translations of these Avestan texts, they were aware that there was a distinction between gloss and text, so that they could distinguish between textual and metatextual material. Why I say that? Because they translate everything exactly the same. So they didn't make any distinction, or they didn't, let's say, choose to translate something and omit the rest because they consider it a secondary material. They put the same level to the translation, so basically translated everything in a row. And perhaps because they didn't have any mark to distinguish, here we have the beginning of the gloss. So basically they are reciting the text in the same intonation, perhaps. There is no difference, and because there is no apparent difference, the translator in Pahlavi wouldn't be sure where to cut the text. So probably he didn't dare to do that, probably. That's my opinion, at least. But.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor, for your presentation. I mean, from what I understand, when we have a recital text, something that's like a ritual, the intention is to keep it regular, or the way it was intended to be spoken. Does the inclusion of glosses show a different tradition of how prayers are recited in Vedic literature as well?
Different with regards to what exactly?
I mean, if I think of a prayer, if I think of history of transmission, there would be the intention to keep glosses outside of what is actually meant to be spoken?
Not really, because if that would be the case, all these glosses would not be part of the ritual. And for instance, the 3 chapters of the Yasna 19 to 21, will be out of the ritual too.
I see.
Because they are very clearly commentaries. They are very clearly. I mean, since the beginning of our studies, and of course, most probably by the priestly authorities before our studies, they were already identified as a commentary. And if they were included in the Yasna ritual during centuries, generations, since our first manuscript for sure, I don't think there is any reason to separate that. So
I just find this very fascinating. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Tully.
Thank you.
Okay, our next speaker is Professor Palsatia of University of Guelph, who graciously decided to leave his sabbatical cave and come here in the gathering honoring Dr. Bagli. Professor Palsatia, please.
Thanks very much, Mohammed. I'm really honored to be here today in honor of Jehan Bagli. Jehan Bagli is really an extraordinary man of not only great intellect, but of true humanity. I remember the last symposium that you organized where Jehan had taken part, And at the end of everything, when everyone was quite tired, John gave his ideas on Zoroastrianism and Parsi studies. And he went on and on and on and on. And yet everyone was so delighted by the enthusiasm he showed that nobody said anything. And that was summed up Jehan, a man of great intellect, curiosity, energy, and heart. So I'm very honored to be here today. I'm also delighted to know that Zoroastrian studies are in such good hands by the excellent talks we've had today. I'd like to drag you a little bit away from Iran, but to India. I am a historian of India and of the Parsis in particular, and I would like to give you some insights on the writing of Parsi history from a both analytical and narrative perspective. I call my talk The Parsis of India, Community Evolution and Historical Text. In 1884, the preeminent historian of the Parsis, Dosabai Ramji Karaka, wrote his History of the Parsis, and it would set the pattern of how Parsi history was written. In his work, Dosabai Ramji said that the Parsis, it may be said, are well launched on the path of progress. Better and brighter days dawn for them. They have arisen from poverty and oppression to security and wealth. It has developed in their race those high qualities which history attributes to their early ancestors. And indeed, he set the pattern of writing Parsi history, which was one of great accomplishments, if not exceptionalism. And many historians took their cue from Dosabai Ramji well into the 19th and 20th century. Parsi luster on Indian soil, the famous Parsis, Parsis and sports, noting all of the great accomplishments that the Parsis took part in. And his history writing both describes the situation of the Parsis and serves to highlight the relevancy of this small community to itself and the outside world. At the same time, as an academic historian, I would suggest that such historical writing can often obscure processes that shaped and informed Parsi history. The pattern of historical response. In my own writings, I have postulated that both internal and external factors have shaped Parsi history. And indeed, I have put forward the idea that a pattern of historical response emerges, whereby the Parsis of India assimilated themselves to the Indian setting, adapted aspects of the social milieu to their interests, and indeed would even become agents of change as a way of preserving identity. One of the chief factors, internal factors that of course shaped Parsi identity was their acute sense of minority status. They were a minuscule minority community in a veritable ocean of humanity, all throughout their history. As up to 1920, the Parsis of India numbered only 120,000, and today maybe in India counted about, 55,000. The minority in India, the Parsis developed a historical imperative, perhaps not even consciously known to them, to safeguard their community interests and group identity as Parsis and at all times and under all conditions. And Parsis would emerge agents of change and develop an astute sense of the historical change, trends in society, and often pioneer changes ahead of those trends to keep relevant. The Indian setting. One of the external factors that shaped the Parsi identity was, of course, India. From Iran to India, the Parsis came to a place that essentially allowed them to keep their sense of identity as they saw fit. Essentially, the Indian setting left them alone. And in India, the Parsis not only began to safeguard their religious identity, but in fact even elaborate upon it. There has not been that much study on the changes in Zoroastrianism in India, but in India, many of the things that the Zoroastrians of Iran could not take for granted, the Parsis could. And indeed, you see the elaboration of the fire ritual, its grand enthronement, its placement in a great fire temple, perhaps even copying Hindu temple ideas, and the rise of temple cult itself. One of the most dramatic changes in Parsi customs was the adoption of endogamy, or marriage within the community itself, a strict endogamy, in fact. And here you have an example of a Parsi marriage. The earliest of historical sources and texts also convey this pattern which I'm mentioning. Parsi tradition relates that the Zoroastrians of Iran came to India in the 8th century. Now, this is a debated time, but if we accept that as the tradition, two works in particular, the Persian Qisse-i Sanjan, or Story of Sanjan, where they finally landed in India, and some 16 Sanskrit shlokas, or tales, convey the arrival and settlement of the Parsis in India. And this is largely a story of assimilation to India, where they explain to the local Raja their customs and that they will adopt the customs of India and be peaceable subjects of it. Not only peaceable subjects of India, but they would add to the richness of the Indian fabric. The historical evidence also confirms Parsi settlements and integration into India. They settled across all of the towns and hamlets of Western India and Gujarat. They took to all of the professions of the local setting. And in their local dress, their dietary customs, and many social norms, they essentially became Indianized. They, of course, forgot their Persian language and adopted the languages of India. But at the same time, they also can reaffirm the uniqueness of their identity. From the 14th century, the first dakmas appear in the Indian setting at Bharuch and other places. The dakma, of course, being the Zoroastrian funerary structure. Fire temples take place all across the Mofussil. So in one respect, it is a story of great assimilation and loss of culture from Iran, but it is also the story of preserving what became the essential quality of the community, their religion. Other external factors would also shape the Parsis. There was no greater historical change for the Parsis than the arrival of the Europeans in India from the 18th century. For this offered enterprising Parsis a way forward. This is where the agency of the Parsis would come in. And it is no coincidence, in fact, that the Parsis and the British, amongst the Europeans, the British would be the group that the Parsis created the greatest contacts with. The British were actually in a similar situation to the Parsis. The Parsis were not a long-established trading community like the Banyas and others, and the British too were not natural traders. The Portuguese had been there in India before them, even the Dutch, and so Parsi and British collaboration seemed a mutually beneficial thing. Parsis would introduce British to the trade of India, the goods of India, the basic provisions, and the Parsis gained a powerful trading enterprise that came from afar. The Parsis, I would add, as a historian of India, were not unique among the mercantile communities of India. There were many enterprising Indians, and I would have us get away from the idea that somehow the Parsis were exceptional to the rest of India. They competed alongside many trading communities, but at the same time, those factors I mentioned which so impinged upon Parsi identity also contributed something new. They had to pioneer new commercial strategies to see them prosper in the new social and economic milieu. The example of Rustam Manak of Surat is perhaps the best example. Rustam Manak was from the town of Surat, a very competitive scene for the Europeans and Indians, and he developed a commercial strategy. One was the economic collaboration with the Europeans. He too saw in the Europeans something that could benefit him personally and perhaps even his community collectively. He would also be one of the first to diversify economic activities, evolving into what was coming to be known as the broker. And the broker was someone who did almost anything for commercial benefit. And he also engaged in the operation of a family business. All three of these together distinguished the new Parsi commercial pattern. And this was one that replicated itself in the sense that his sons followed him and were prosperous too. They would add further to this pattern of Parsi identity consolidation in giving great charity and philanthropy to the community as a whole from their economic success. Hence, the Parsis in this very early period followed a social strategy as well, to forge moral and social ties within the community, using their new wealth, charity, and they thereby set out and staked a unique identity of Parsis that were a Parsis affinity and foreignness to the English and other Indians, in a sense that they were their own unique people. And they would stake out, of course, their unique religious and community position. Nothing would, of course, change the social state and economic state of the Parsis more than the founding of Bombay. Bombay, initially a Portuguese colonial possession, by the late 1660s became a British colonial asset. And it was here that the Parsis would make Bombay their economic, political, religious, and social center, uniquely a place where Parsis would gather. And very quickly, many Parsis came to operate in Bombay and even go well beyond what the British had done there to take hold of creating a new economic life in the city. Great Parsi names and families emerged from this process: the Nanabais, the Dorabjis, the Patels, the Banajis, the Modis, the Wadias, and the Jamsetji boys. From obscure minor traders to merchant princes would emerge. And these merchant princes would come to be known as the great Shaitias and community leaders. Oh, sorry. Bombay would become the workhouse of the Parsis, and they would see to the emigration of more and more Parsis to India. They would utilize philanthropy and charity to build the moral structure of a community, fire temples, dakmas, and residential colonies. And the Parsis were also very cosmopolitan, as Trikanagit Roy has mentioned, in that they didn't just give charity to their own community, but the community in general. One of the first wells sunk in Bombay was by a Parsi for the benefit of all Indians. The Parsis, as a small community, operated under the rule that they benefited when the entire social milieu benefited. These strategies would see the Parsis on an international stage, operate on an international stage. And one of the first aspects of the new capitalist era emerging was an Eastern triangular trade between the West, India, and China. And Parsis were some of the first to take part in this. A sort of dark history in the Parsi, by today's standards. The Parsis were some of the first opium traders, traffickers, if you will, trafficking this very lucrative commodity to China in exchange for the famous tea that the whole world wanted. As Bomanji Wadia noted, one of the great traders, opium was the most lucrative commodity I have traded in. And this trade in opium and other aspects of China trade would see some of the first modern diasporas of the Parsis develop. The first diaspora was in East Asia. If we don't count India as a diaspora, if we count India as the homeland of the Parsis rather than Iran, then East Asia is their first diaspora. The Parsis were instrumental in the rise of the colony of Hong Kong. Here, Parsis in particular were known as whiteheads for the white turbans that they wore. And in Hong Kong, they would become businessmen and eminent citizens. In 1841, Dadabai Rustamji, known as Daddy Boy, established the Hong Kong Hotel, one of the first in the colony, if not the first. In 1852, Dorabji Nauroji Mittewala builds the Victoria and King Edward and Kowloon hotels. And in 1898, the very famous ferry that still exists in Hong Kong today was started by the Parsis. The Tatas would come to Hong Kong, and other names would distinguish themselves in the city too. H.N. Modi, who erected the University of Hong Kong. The China trade would also, as an aside, lead to changes in Parsi material culture, and nothing reflects more the intermeshing of cultures than the saris that Indian women wore. The very famous cores and borders and even patterns on regular saris that many 19th century women wore, and which are very vintage clothing now, took on the symbols that came from China. Perhaps no China trader was more famous than the subject of my recent book, Jamsetji Jiji Boy. His is the true rags to riches story, who went from collecting bottles on the street to having an international shipping empire. He was so famous, he became the first Indian knight and the first hereditary peer or baronet by Queen Victoria. And he did this because he brought together all the insight that the traders before him had, from Rustam Manak to others. He would transform his economic wealth into large-scale philanthropy and social-political contacts. And in particular, he saw the model of how a native, how an Indian, how a colonial could rise in the hegemony of imperialism, which was in some ways to take part within it, to carve out his place within it amongst the British, and to in fact co-opt the rulers into the needs of the colonial. One of his greatest triumphs was the creation of the first public hospital or private hospital in Bombay, the Jamsetji Jijibai Hospital, here in its original architecture. And this was his brilliant idea that the British and the Indians should become partners. That is to say that the British offered a sort of security on the Board of Trustees to this institution, that this was a way of British and Indian cooperating in the development of the civic society together. And so he gave great amounts of money, some 2 million pounds sterling, to the creation of this hospital. But of course, even for a Parsi, which is often overlooked, colonialism is colonialism. And Jamsetji Jijibai faced many challenges in seeing his vision through. This is often neglected in the literature, that Parsis faced many obstacles to achieving what they did in the colonial setting. And despite the British not wanting to be true partners with the Indians, despite the British essentially relegating JJ to a minority position as a donor, he persevered in offering his money and saw the hospital built. The Parsis also had this unique strategy that they often diversified from some enterprise that they entered into. They were the first to get into the opium trade, and they were the first to leave it amongst Asians as they saw what was ahead. And all of the money of the China trade would see to being diversified into new financial, industrial enterprises in Bombay City. So they knew where to invest and what the future seemed to hold. Nothing speaks to the Parsi insight into what the future held than the belief in education. You know, it is a great myth of imperialism that somehow the British brought English education and the like to India. The British introduced English education, but it would have gone nowhere if Indians didn't take to it, didn't finance schools, didn't teach in schools. And the Parsis were some of the first to understand that this new medium of Western education and curriculum and English language education would benefit them. They saw the wave of the future. And indeed, the Parsi community was one of the first in Western India to found schools for boys and schools for girls. Some Parsis, very intuitive Parsis, had crossed the line to understanding the development of women's education and women's emancipation was as important as that of the development of men. And indeed, if you read some of the works of Nauroji Fardunji, you would think you were reading J.S. Mill's treatise on the education of women. True to their pattern, sorry, here. I love this photo. This was a photo taken at the Alexandra Girls' School, created by Manakji Kursitji Shroff, one of the first schools for educating women. Now, I don't suggest that these women were educated in the same curriculum as men. I'm sure social studies took pride of place, knitting and things like that. But nevertheless, a segment of the community had seen fit to balance the educational interests of the community. True to the pattern of response I've mentioned to you, the Parsis also were some of the first to champion Indian nationalism. Now, nationalism in India was, for the most part, antithetical to the interests of the Parsis, who had benefited under colonialism. Yet a segment of them, men like Dadabhai Nauroji, Firoz Shah Mehta, and Dinshaw Wacha, understood the trend of the future, that the true interests of the Parsi community lay in eventually adopting nationalism. Grateful to the British, yes, but also ready now to assume a responsibility for themselves and ruling India. And of course, Dadabhai Nauroji was one of the first to put forward the economic argument for nationalism through his famous drain theory. The 19th century, the late 19th century, would witness a rapidity of social adaptability on the part of the Parsis as they took to law and all of the major professions, and their talents would spread worldwide. A very famous, though often forgotten, artist who was resident in Britain was Mansur Shah Pitwala, who painted the Parsi gentleman here. What about post-independence? In many respects, the Parsis would face great challenges after India's independence in 1947. In many respects, they didn't face anything they hadn't before, but now more and more Indians were educated, more and more Indians were taking part in economics, and so naturally the Parsis had to compete with all of these. And therefore, the tally of accomplishments are still there, but there are also great challenges made obvious now. Poverty, dependency, illness, all came to define the Parsi community. In many respects, those topics had always been there, but now, under this new prism of independence, the Parsis highlighted these points more. How the community was dying in some ways, how its population was declining, how too many people were in the social colonies. What was once a proud boast now became a sort of regret or something like that. And as a result, this period from 1950s to the 1970s, you have this sort of trope of decay infest Parsi writings. Now, though, something new has happened. There is both the nostalgia for the Parsis and, yes, the tally of accomplishments. Did you know that the first person to swim the English Channel in handcuffs was a Parsi? Yes. But now, of course, we have a new generation of scholars, too, who are extraordinarily highlighting the true nature of the Parsi community. In one sense, they want to document us all before we die out. There's been, just as we have an effervescence in Zoroastrian studies, we're finding a new effervescence in Parsi studies too. I've only touched upon aspects of the community and the like, and please do ask me any questions you have. Thanks very much.
This is not a question, it's more sort of it's a question and a commentary. I wonder whether when you were researching both your books, you came across, let me just put it in context. This shows my age as well. Let's say about 1984 to about 1990, one of these families you were referring to opened their archives to a small group of lay scholars. Who started writing the family history. I happened to, of course, float around at that time and saw some of the correspondence letters. Eventually, that family would close the books on that research because they weren't comfortable with the references to the good drug, which is what in the correspondence opium was. And the protests as the British were beginning to pull their support away from this. I just wonder whether you ever came across that stuff, those documents and that manuscript.
Yeah, you know, as an academic historian, I went to Cambridge to look at the Matheson archives, and I did look at the Jamshedji letter books. I think I and Asiya Siddiqui are probably the ones who've looked at them the most. Yes, there was a tendency amongst the Parsis to want to praise themselves all the time and not let all of the other aspects and that was probably the most dark period. But let me say something as a historian. I'm not a historian who blames the British for everything. I'm not a historian who thinks of Orientalism as something dirty. I am a historian who wants to understand what happened and why, not make modern commentaries on how bad things were. That's not history, that's present day identity politics. I'm not in favor of tearing down every statue and the like, etc. So I think the point is that the opium trade was something that happened. And it wasn't bad or good, it was something that happened. It had bad and good consequences. And in all of my readings of Jamshedji's many letters, he never once regretted or felt any qualms about that trade. He adopted the ideology of the time that India was a source of supply, and China was a source of demand, and the like. We today, of course, would never condone anyone selling a narcotic drug to anyone else. We today don't condone anyone living under an imperialism or an occupation, but that's different from how people saw the past. And the like. Jamshedji was smart enough to know that this was not the wave of the future, and he divested himself of the opium trade, but the Parsis took part in it. And the opium trade, yes, addicted the Chinese, but it also was a major impact on the world economy, and many of the benefits that came to the West and the East was a result of that too. History is all things together, not just what you want to select out and say, I love it or I hate it, etc. So I don't know quite if it, today still I think there is this less it's more ignorance that the Parsis took part in this rather than wanting to hide it in some ways. And the more Parsis that do hear about it, they say, wow, what a fellow Jijibai was.
Young man, I saw one of those families pull back from recording their history because they didn't want to, they didn't move on.
Yeah, as with all things, the Parsis are the victims of their success, aren't they, in many respects?
Any more questions? Yes.
Regarding the British, when they came, were there any Parsis opposed to the British? Like, for example, Feroz Gandhi, and it seems like many Parsis themselves didn't want British rule as well. And it also seems like they quickly adopted Western values, like they no longer cover their heads, like in the picture you showed.
What period are you speaking about?
Towards the end of the Raj.
Sure. By that time, circumstances had changed. Many people saw the limitations of the Raj. They saw its economic exploitation. They saw themselves being educated and wanting to take part in the running of their own country. And a segment of the Parsis appreciated that more than anyone, Dadabhai Naoroji and others who would go into nationalism and indeed foster it, become architects of it and the like. But they didn't hate the British. They just believed that the British time had come and it was time for them to go. The people who led the Indian nationalist movement, the official Indian nationalist movement, were all of that sort of constitutional system of, we are now going to want to take our place as rulers, your time is over, that sort of thing. So nobody quite hated the British, they were wanting them to go. There's another segment of India, yes, who took a more different approach, that we will not tolerate any British in India and go on. But India comes to independence not because Indians gave a few tamachas and kicked out the British. That's a great myth. It came to independence because people like Gandhi and others saw the nonviolent, legalistic approach to bring India to independence. Thanks very much.
We are now coming to the closing remarks. Mr. Arzan Samwadia, the president of Faizana, was supposed to be here. Unfortunately, after spending approximately 3 hours on the plane, departing from New York for Toronto, the flight was canceled. Therefore, we do not have the honor of having him join us today here, but we have our next speaker, Mr. Homi Gandhi, who was the former president of Faizana, was at the time that I really worked with him, and Dr. Jehan Bagli, and both of them have been a great source of inspiration for me and helped to constitute the University of Toronto as a pillar of Zoroastrian studies in North America. With gratitude, please, Mr. Gandhi.
Hello, Jean. We are missing you today. I was looking forward to you being here. Well, you all must be tired now after a long lay. I know that you all must be waiting that this symposium finishes soon so that you can go home, enjoy your dinner, watch football game or whatever your enjoyable favorite enjoyment is. However, I wish to inform you that there is going to be an important announcement at the end of my presentation. So if you want to know it firsthand, you may wait till the very end. And at the outset, I regret and I'd like to convey a sincere apology from my friend and colleague, Hassan Wadia, who is the Fazana president, that he is unable to come. He wrote to me yesterday, I was really looking forward to this event for a very, very long time. Unfortunately, being on tarmac for 3 hours at the LaGuardia airport, the plane was brought back to the terminal, no flights yesterday, and no seats on today's flights. So he is not here today. Completely dejected, but sending his good wishes for a successful event. So over 4 years ago, the University of Toronto, Department of Near and Middle Eastern Civilizations, and the Toronto Initiative for Iranian Studies hosted a symposium on Zoroastrian studies in celebration of the memory of Professor Yasn Yashitter, founder and editor of Encyclopedia Iranica. It was the first time that the Federation of Zoroastrian Association of North America, FZANA, the Zoroastrian Society of Ontario, and the Ontario Zoroastrian Community Foundation had co-sponsored an event with the University of Toronto. I was an attendee at the symposium on that day, but not a speaker on the program. However, Professor Tawakoli strayed from the program and invited me to share my thoughts in the program's closing remarks. I presume I did a good job, as I am now officially on the program to give the closing remarks for this symposium. Professor Tawakoli, respected speakers and friends, and Ervad Dr. Jehan Bagli. Today we are gathered to enjoy the Zoroastrian Studies Symposium in honor of you, Ervad Dr. Jehan Bagli, presented by the Elahé Omidyar Mir-Djalali Institute of Iranian Studies in collaboration with FZANA, the Ontario Zoroastrian Community, the Zoroastrian Society of Ontario, and the Encyclopedia Iranica Foundation. For the last 5 hours, I've been learning a lot about Zoroastrianism studies, and I've taken copious notes. I would offer to read them now, but it would take likely another 5 hours. So I'll summarize here for everyone's relief and convenience. But before I begin my comments, here is a short interruption with a commercial promotion of the Zoroastrian Global Glossary. I would like to read out a message from a very good friend of mine, Omidyar, who is present here today. The message reads, the Zoroastrian Global Glossary is a tool devised to standardize the English spellings of Zoroastrian terms. We are proud to announce that version 2 of that project was just launched at the recent World Zoroastrian Youth Congress in London. If you want to confirm how to spell a Zoroastrian term in English, please visit Fazana website at fazana.org/glossary. The organizing team for this glossary is made up of academics, priests, and teachers. We would love the community to use this tool, share it with others, especially our younger generations. All feedback is most welcome. This commercial message is over. Sir, I would summarize my comments for everyone's relief and convenience of what I learned today. I was enlightened by the subject of forgiveness and mercy historically and in Zoroastrian scriptures. I was also educated about the detailed life of Zoroaster as described in the Dinkud from different groups of philosophers. Descriptions of the details about the accusations and realities with historical reference to Mazdakites, the Mithridates, and Khurramdins during the Parthian Sasanian period was very interesting. The personal property laws of the 7th to 10th century AD, inheritance in Zoroastrian legal tradition, which was a complete change from what was originally practiced in the times of Zarathustra, but it was enlightening. The interesting dialogue between Zoroastrianism and Judaism on Wahman was very well analyzed. A brilliant analysis of Avestan language with problems faced by the students of the language confirmed my belief that learning of Avestan language will be challenging for me even at this very young age. And having born in India as a Parsi, I was aware of this history. My first school was Jamsetji Jijipai Elementary School and Rustamji Sorabji Dalal High School in Bharuch, where I was born. However, there were minor historical details for which I was enlightened. Lastly, I would like to close my comments this afternoon by taking a few minutes to say a few words about Ervad Dr. Jehan Bagli, in whose honor this symposium is being held. In Dolly Dastu's opening remarks, you were told about the glorious life story of Ervad Dr. Jehan Bagli, his professional achievements, and his immense contribution to the Zoroastrian community. I would like to add to that and share a few personal stories. And I think probably this was the very first time of all the speakers I met Dr. Jehan Bagli. In August 1967, I landed up in Montreal as part of my North American trip. I was traveling via Greyhound bus, $99 for 99 days. It was a New Year's Day, according to the Shanshai calendar, one of 3 calendars we Zoroastrians follow. I thought maybe I could celebrate it with a traditional Parsi meal. So I got a hold of Yellow Pages. I don't know how many of you remember Yellow Pages. And decided to see if I could find a local Zoroastrian in Montreal who would guide me. I found your name and number, Jehan Bagli, and so I called you to find out whether there was a Shensai New Year celebration by Zarathustrians in Montreal. I said that my brother and I are visiting Expo 67 in Montreal, and we wanted to meet our own and enjoy a Parsi meal after traveling on the Greyhound bus for over 45 days. You mentioned that there was no organized Zoroastrian group as yet, and invited me to your home. We enjoyed the meal, found many connections in true Parsi tradition, even one in Bharuch, where I was born, from Freni's family side. We renewed our connection after I returned to the USA in the early 1980s through various Zoroastrian events and increased our contact, including exchanging notes on Zoroastrian studies after you took over the mantle of chairmanship of Fazana Research and Preservation Committee. Fast forward to 2009, you came to stay at my home in New Jersey for the Gatha Colloquium in New York, along with 3 other Zarathustri friends. After everybody had left, we went out for a short walk to the county park in Glen Rock. That was the longest walk of my life, spanning over 2 hours. We chatted about almost everything, from our first meeting day to that day. What we have been doing, the people who have crossed our path, our mentors, the issues facing our community, etc., etc. The underlying theme of all that was how we can better ourselves individually and as a group. This was a living experience for me. Before that meeting and afterwards, you have been a great mentor to me, especially directing me to the right prayers I have been offering at many interfaith and international events. Although I have been an external face for the North American Zoroastrian community for the last 20 plus years, it is individuals like you, Ervad, Dr. Jehan Bagli, who have guided me in that process. My Zoroastrian 101 knowledge has been improved in the right direction. For several years, Fazana and the North American Zoroastrian community had an interest in establishing a permanent position in Zoroastrian studies at a well-known academic institution. So the news of establishment of the Ehsan Yashitter lectureship in Avesta and Pelvi languages in the Department of Near and Middle Eastern Studies at the University of Toronto in 2016 was encouraging. The announcement in 2016 read, the addition of courses in Avesta and Pelvi languages strengthens the department's capacity to foster the advanced study of Zoroastrianism. I was excited. I remember that you, Jehan, had mentioned many times in the past that your personal interest in Zoroastrian studies had brought you in close contact with the Department of Near and Middle Eastern Studies at the University of Toronto over the past several years. So I approached you to explore the possibility towards the goal of having an institute of Zoroastrian studies that can provide an opportunity for the advanced studies and research in Zoroastrian faith in North America. You brought a proposal from the University of Toronto to the Fazana annual general meeting in 2017 in Houston. Coincidentally, it was at that meeting that Fazana awarded the Lifetime Achievement Award for your long and distinguished career and service to the Zoroastrian community, which has brought recognition to our community worldwide. But the proposal you brought was not what we had in mind. We envisaged an institution that served a pivotal role in catalyzing research, providing education, and publishing its work on Zoroastrianism in North America and globally. This institution would offer the opportunity for undergraduate and graduate students to study ancient Zoroastrian sacred texts, manuscripts, its history and culture in the original Avesta, Pahlavi, Persian, and Gujarati languages. It would foster public engagement activities which would strengthen the relationships within the Zoroastrian diaspora, both locally and globally. Most importantly, we envision an institution that advances the understanding and appreciation of our ancient religion and its history, culture, languages, and people to inure to the benefit of our own community. To arm our children with the knowledge of our noble faith, to allow them to feel pride in continuing to practice it. Such an institution would nurture the next generation of scholars and leaders in the field and our North American Zoroastrian community. As such, Fazana was exploring the establishment of a center of dedicated Zoroastrian scholarship on this continent, like the Chair of Zoroastrian Studies, which was recently established at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London. The Fazana Ad Hoc Committee under your joint leadership evaluated all the proposals for such an institution on Zoroastrian studies. After the committee's overwhelming vote for the University of Toronto's proposal, you facilitated our discussion with Professor Tawakkoli and his team at the university for further clarifications and discussions on their proposal, and we moved one step closer to realizing our vision. Jehan Bagli, you were the primary mover in writing to generous donors in the Zoroastrian community after that day. And when we were unable to break through for a commitment from a family to establish a chair, we had a joint meeting with the University of Toronto team in April 2019, a day before the Yasn Symposium, to create a fund under Fazana to begin the baby steps for this cause. And when all the fund formalities were completed, you were one of the first donors to contribute a generous amount for the Fazana professorship. This is nothing but a living example of Zoroaster. Good deeds following the good thoughts and good words. You pursued the project by calling and writing to all your connections till the goal of necessary funds were achieved. And with your extensive efforts and determination, we have achieved today the Fazana Professorship for Zoroastrian Languages and Literature at the University of Toronto. Thank you, Ervad Jehan Bagli, for all your efforts. Good luck and best wishes for your retirement. May you enjoy many years ahead with Franny, your family, and your friends. Thank you for all the help and guidance you have shown me over many years. Your kindness, your knowledge, your understanding, your listening skills, which many of us lack. And most importantly, for bringing together our community. We are a stronger and more cohesive community because of you, and we are immensely grateful. Thank you, John. And before I finished, here is an announcement. I'm privileged and honored to make this announcement. Ervad, Dr. Jehan Bagli, there is going to be a Jehan Bagli lecture series in Zoroastrian studies. I've been requested by Professor Muhammad Tawakkoli Taghi that this Jehan Bagli Family Lecture Series in Zoroastrian Studies in honor of Jehan Bagli will continue in future. This lecture series in Zoroastrian Studies supports the dissemination of knowledge with respect to Zoroastrianism and related fields through a series of public lectures offered by the Elahé Omidyar Mir-Djalali Institute of Zoroastrian Studies. And here is the URL, engage.utoronto.ca/Bagli lecture. I think it should come up a little bit.
Which is also on the brochure.
Okay. All right.
They will show.
Thank you very much for giving me the privilege to make this announcement.